This time we're going to look at today's Torah portion. It comes from Leviticus. This is the second to last Torah portion in Leviticus. It's called Emor. Emor means speak, as in the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron, or speak to the priest. And there's the word Emor. And just as kind of a quick reminder of where we have been in the book of Leviticus, Leviticus itself starts off with sacrifices. Thank you. Quick reminder to move us forward. There we go. So Leviticus itself has several chapters that talk about sacrifices. It talks about the burnt offering, grain, peace, sin offering, and it reviews those a couple of times in different perspectives, different ways. It talks about the ordination of the priests and the beginning of their service. It's probably less successful than they wished it had been. They lost 2 sons, the eldest sons of Aaron, with strange fire. Leviticus 11 talks about clean and unclean food. What is food and what's not food? Then we get the purification requirements and skin disease regulations, discharges, the Day of Atonement, the forbidding of eating or drinking anything with blood, unlawful sexual relations. There's various laws, and then finally we come to the death penalty and the various sins that can lead to the death penalty. That brings us to today. Today we're in Leviticus 21. It's not a big surprise with that quick summary of everything that was covered so far, a quick summary of what was covered in Leviticus. It's not most people's favorite book. People might look at Leviticus and say, some of this actually makes my stomach hurt. I hope that as I dig into some of the probably most difficult topics in Leviticus, you won't think the same when I'm finished here after the Torah portion. 21 starts off with the purity of the priests, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Then we go into sacrifices. What is allowed as a sacrifice, what is not? Leviticus 23, our favorite chapter, I know. Any Messianic's favorite chapter of Leviticus has got to be 23 because we look at the feasts and all the appointed time, the Moedim. It's wonderful. We talk about it every year, and we talk about it several times a year. Then the rules for blasphemy is 24. Then injury, what happens for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. People might look at Leviticus and say, okay, we're good? Okay. And then finally, there's one law for everyone. There's not one law for the native born, and there's not another law for the people who convert and join God's community. There's just one law. There's then a portion from Ezekiel. Ezekiel 44 covers prophecies of Zadok the priest, and it gives many of the same laws that I'll talk about today. And finally, Colossians. We'll tie it up today with Colossians 2. In there, Paul talks about circumcision, the right way of doing circumcision, but also he talks about a shadow of things to come, referring to the ceremonies we have in the temple, and then to beware of human commands. And now I want to dig in. I want to dig in a little bit into that purity of the priests. So I give you a quick high overview, but if you look at the triennial breakup of the Parsha, know that there's certain parts of the Parsha that we really focus on each year. And for 3 years, you'll focus on different parts of each Parsha. Today, this year, we're focused on the beginning. We're focused on Leviticus 21:1 through 22:16. And I'm going to bleed over a little into the sacrifices, but I want to focus first on those priests. Did you know that when a priest was to bring a sacrifice, that he has to be perfect? And the way I've been taught in the past about sacrifices was that, think about a sacrifice this way. It's you taking your imperfections, putting them on a sacrifice, and then that sacrifice being perfect will atone for you, and you impart uncleanness to it, and then the cleanness is imparted to you. Like we're trading, like there's a transmission of one to the other. And that's how I was taught about these things. And then next thing I know, I'm reading here in Leviticus 21, and it says that the priest has to be perfect. And it describes a lot of attributes of the priest that has to be perfect. It's a lot of outward things, but it's very clear when I read more in Leviticus, it's not just the outside, it's the inside. The person has to be perfect who brings the sacrifice. Not only that, the sacrifice itself has to be perfect. And so some of the ways that someone as the rules are applied here, a priest may not even visit a dead body, not unless it's a close relative. And if they visit a close relative, they have to wait 7 days, and then they can approach again to do their duties in the temple. They can't make a bald spot. If there is someone who dies, they can't mourn in the ways that the nations around the Israelites would do. They would mourn by cutting bald spots and ripping the corners of their beards. They're not allowed to do that. They can't take a knife and cut their bodies. They can't make permanent marks on their bodies as symbols of ritual mourning. All of that is forbidden. Priests have to be perfect. You can't do these things. They have to marry a virgin. They can't marry someone who's been married before, definitely not a prostitute, and they have to wear neat clothes, no holes in their clothes. They can't have anything wrong with their body, no physical defects. They can't be missing an arm or a leg. They can't have a sunken nose. They can't be blind, lame. The person must be perfect inside and out. And then when you look into 22, you'll see that even when you go back to look at some of the discharge and the bodily, the skin disease, all those rules still apply to priests. A priest is not allowed to come forward to God's holy sanctuary with any imperfections, any diseases whatsoever. Must be perfect. And so, as I'm looking at these things and I'm thinking about it, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the meaning of sacrifices. And so today, I put together for us just a quick review of what a sacrifice might look like. And first of all, the question you might ask, what is the word behind the word sacrifice? Well, it's korban. I have the word korbanot, just plural for korban. What is korban? What does that mean? It doesn't mean sacrifice. It doesn't mean kill. It doesn't mean give up something that's of value to you in order for gain to someone else. It's not that. It actually comes from a root that means karov, close. Korban comes from closeness. And what do you do when you approach someone of great honor? When you approach them, you give a gift. And if you want to approach God, you must not do so empty-handed. I wouldn't do it. Korban is your way of approaching and getting close. And so here are various ways of doing so. First of all, you have a fellowship offering. In Hebrew, the fellowship offering is called shlomim. Shlomim, as in the root for peace. So it can also be called a peace offering. You might hear it called one or the other. Shlomim is the word in Hebrew. Shlomim is interesting because this is the first one that starts to look like the Passover. The Passover sacrifice is an interesting one because it's different than many of the other sacrifices. If you notice that when you look at the sin offering or the burnt offering, that those are either consumed by only the priest or there's something that's completely consumed by fire, but not the peace offering, not the Shlomim. That one is shared by all. The person who brings it shares it with the priests, shares it with the Levites. Everyone in the community shares this one. It's a different one. This one is what you should think of when you should think of Passover. Passover looks like this. Tithe looks like this. You bring your tithe and you eat it at the sanctuary. You share it. You have to tithe. It's eaten by you, your family, the Levites, the priests. Same as the Passover. It's brought 3 times a year whenever you're harvesting. You bring the firstborn of your flocks. This is what you bring. So it can be brought for Thanksgiving. It can be brought for a vow, free will. There's multiple reasons why you might bring it. But what it looks like is this. When Jesus was sitting at the table with his disciples, and he looked among them, and he said, he broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples, they shared it. That's the picture that you get, is we're sharing this together. This is a covenant. It's the beginning of a covenant or the renewing of a covenant. When people share something together, we share a meal. This is the picture of the peace offering. The peace offering. It's very different from the other offerings. And so when he is sharing that with his disciples, it should make in your mind a connection to a covenant. This is the bread of the new covenant. This is the blood, my blood for the new covenant. That's what he's talking about. So then, what are the other connections of Jesus to these these offerings, to these sacrifices? Because many times when I've studied this or I've had lessons, I've learned a little bit about sacrifices, one of the first things I hear is sacrifices are only meant for pointing at Jesus and his death on the cross. And sometimes it felt to me when I heard comments like that where, don't worry about studying the sacrifices, just study Jesus because they're just pointing you to Jesus, just study Jesus instead. But here I'm doing a Torah portion that's focused on the sacrifices, and I'm giving it a deeper look. And I want you all to look at this with me. Sin offering. Is this the one that represents Jesus? And we talked about him being represented in the Passover, in the fellowship, but what about the sin offering? Well, sin offering is a chatat. The word in Hebrew is chatat. What you'll see is it's initially only meant for unintentional sins. So it's not something that you can sin out there and then bring a chatat and everything is fine. It's only for unintentional sins. There's another version of the sin offering called a guilt offering. The guilt offering is if you find that you have wronged your neighbor, make it right. And if you look at Matthew chapter 5:23, then you'll see there's a mention of this from Jesus when he is giving a Sermon on the Mount. What he says is, if you've brought your gift to the altar and you remember that you have a grudge against your brother, leave it. Don't give it. Go and make things right with your brother. You have to make restitution. You can't bring a guilt sacrifice before you make things right with your brother, or instead of making things right with your brother. It is after you make things right with all of those out there who you have something, again, get these relationships right, and then bring your offering to the altar. That's what you should think of in the sin offering. It's completely, by the way, completely eaten by the priest. And what about the burned offering? Burned offering is actually olah. And olah does not mean burn. It has nothing to do with burn. Olah is actually the word for rising up. If someone were to go to Israel and to establish citizenship, they make aliyah. It's the same root there. They go up to Israel. And this word is to go up. What happens here is a person will put their hand on their offering. And in that way, this is that symbol I was talking about before, where the transfer is made. An atonement is made for the giver by the animal. The animal is slain, the blood is captured, and then the blood is taken inside the tent and sprinkled on it's put on the horns of the altar, and then it's brought inside the tent. But then everything about that animal is washed in water and then put on the altar, and it is completely consumed by fire. Completely consumed by fire. And if you think about Jesus dying on the cross, that there is more of a picture of the burnt offering, the olah, where Jesus' blood poured out for us. It purifies us. And even at that time, remember, the temple earthquake caused the curtain to tear in two, as in, this is what brings you close. Remember, Korban brings you close. So this is what allows you to come close. And then, more than 40 days later, he rises, completely rises up and disappears in front of our eyes, just like you would expect an olah to do. The grain offering is something that comes as something that you bring with feasts. It's a first fruits offering. It's completely eaten by the priests, or if it's an anointing grain offering, then it's completely consumed by fire. And so those are the main sacrifices. This is what they are, and this is a connection that you would see, I think, most likely bringing us to our Messiah. But is there more? That's my question. Is there more? And I want to point out a few connections that we might have missed before. Because if I'm looking at this with the connections that I've made, then you may be asking the question, is it for today? That's the thing that makes people feel most uncomfortable. Sometimes I've heard this question, if the temple were there today, Andy, would you take a sacrifice? Because it seems so archaic. It's so alien. How could you even imagine doing something like that, or even asking the question? I'm asking a question that's so uncomfortable most people won't even explore it. It's used actually as a question to stop conversation. Whenever somebody asks that question, they don't expect anybody to answer it. They expect you to feel so silly that they even had to bring it up. that you're exploring sacrifices or talking about sacrifices, that it ends the conversation. But I'm not going to let it happen today. Today we're going to talk about it a little bit more because I want to look at some of these connections so that we can talk about what Paul was talking about in Colossians 2, a shadow of things to come. So here I've got one last slide, the symbols connected to Korban. So if you notice what I talked about, perfection, you've got animal that must be perfect. You've got a man that must be perfect, right? The man lays his hand on the animal as if dominating the animal, the leader. These things must happen either in the evening or in the morning. There's certain specific times that they're asked to be brought, and evening and morning are the two times that are brought up, Boker and Erev. And so all those, it's very interesting. I'm thinking about a certain day of creation when all this stuff was revealed. Perfect animals, perfect man, man rules the animals. You are blessed by doing it. They were asked to be fruitful and multiply, and evening and morning. And there was a day. Korban leads to blessing, and it leads to a sanctified people. It leads to rest as well. It sounds like it's not restful, but it is. Because the people who obey God's law and bring his sacrifices are given the blessing of rest. There is no war in their land. It's peace. Think about the way that the actual service takes place. It starts off in the courtyard. It's wide open in the sun. Animal is killed, slaughtered. The blood is captured. The blood is taken inside a tent where it is dark. And we have light and you have darkness. Okay? Important. Not only that, but sometimes you bring grain. It's not only animals. It's the fruit of the earth that you bring. It's part of your sacrifice. You have the earth and it bringing forth the fruit that you bring. You bring your first fruits. What else? You wash. You have a bronze basin. You wash your hands. You wash your sacrifice. You wash your feet. And there's a separation with the bronze washing, right? Your hands and the water flowing from your hands will fill in a basin below, and there's a separation of waters there. And that's another interesting picture. What else? I have to bring them on certain days. The Moedim are the days when I bring them. I bring them at a new moon. I bring them every Shabbat. Those are days set by the sun, moon, and stars, signs and seasons, days and years. We'll bring them. And then finally, with all of those infectious skin diseases, what do? You must completely immerse yourself when you have been healed of your infectious skin diseases, like a fish. You will immerse yourself, cleanse yourself, and when you come out, you will bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons, just like day 5. And if I just remove the top, all I did was just explain to you the days of creation. And if I make this connection, that the connection between the temple and the sacrifices are not actually connected to a fallen world, but a perfect world, it might change your perspective a little bit with the purpose of these korbanot. They are not intended for a wicked people. Wicked people are not allowed to bring a korban. Wicked people are not allowed to approach God. So bringing a sacrifice is not something that fixes you. It doesn't change you. But it does enable you to get close. And that's my point for today from the service, for this portion of Scripture. So I hope that was a blessing for you. From here, we're going to move into a blessing for the children.